The thing about xenobotany was that plants didn't care if you were awkward. They didn't expect witty conversation or proper social cues. They just grew, photosynthesized, and occasionally died, despite your best efforts, which was honestly more straightforward than most human interactions Ethan had experienced. Research outpost Kepler-9 suited him perfectly for exactly that reason. The facility perched on a plateau overlooking purple grasslands that rippled in wind patterns, Ethan still found mesmerizing after 8 months. The outpost itself was a collection of modular structures connected by pressurized corridors, housing representatives from 6 different species, all united by the thrilling goal of figuring out how to grow food on planets that actively didn't want to support life. It was small, cramped, and populated by the kind of scientists who chose remote research over comfortable university positions. Ethan's kind of people, basically. "Ethan, you're doing that thing again, Doctor," Sarah Kim announced, appearing in the doorway of the xenobotany lab with her usual explosive energy. "The thing where you stare at plants and ignore meal breaks. The fern from Kepler 7b is developing the stress response I predicted," Ethan said, without looking up from his microscope. "If I can document the full cycle will still be there in an hour. Food will not come on." Ethan reluctantly abandoned his observation station and followed Sarah toward the communal dining area, a cramped space that somehow fit 12 researchers and their various dietary requirements, without anyone dying from incompatible atmospheres or accidental poisoning. The outpost's social dynamics had taken him months to understand. Dr. Marcus Webb and Dr. James Park formed the Human Research Corps along with Sarah, both older and more established in their fields. Kresh, the Thenari engineer whose species resembled ambulatory mantises and communicated through clicks and gestures, had a dry humor that translated surprisingly well. There were others. A Gorlan physicist whose species breathed methane and stayed in specialized quarters. 2 researchers from the collective who shared a hive-mind connection Ethan found philosophically fascinating and personally terrifying. And then there was Lyra. She sat at the far end of the communal area, eating her meal with the precise, controlled movements characteristic of the Velkari. Alone, as usual, maintaining the careful personal space her culture apparently required. Ethan had learned not to stare, but he noticed her anyway. Had been noticing her for 3 months now, since she'd arrived to work on protein synthesis projects that intersected with his crop research. It was hard not to notice her. The way her silver skin caught light like polished metal, how those long ears adjusted constantly in micro-expressions that betrayed thoughts her carefully neutral face never showed. The fluid grace with which she moved through spaces designed for species with less elegant proportions. "She's doing it again," Sarah said quietly following his gaze. "Doing what?" "Sitting alone, looking like she wishes she could join but doesn't know how." Sarah spooned something that might have been stew into her mouth. "The Velkari are fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Tight clan structures, ritualized social interactions, collective identity over individual expression. Makes them amazing at collaborative research within their own species, but absolute disasters at casual mixed species socializing." "She seems content," Ethan said, trying not to watch Lyra too obviously. "She seems isolated, which isn't the same thing." Sarah pointed her spoon at him. "You should talk to her. You're good with the non-social species." "I'm not good with anyone. I just don't pressure people to perform socially." "Exactly. Which makes you perfect for someone whose entire culture is built around avoiding individual attention." Sarah grinned. "Plus, you have a massive crush on her and think I haven't noticed." Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "I don't, that's not. You stare at her during team meetings. You time your lab schedule to overlap with hers. Last week you spent 30 minutes explaining crop rotation to her when she asked one polite question. You like her." "She's a colleague, from a species I barely understand. It would be inappropriate to." "To what? Talk to her like a person." "Ethan, I'm not saying propose marriage. I'm saying you're both isolated people who happen to work in the same small facility." Maybe you'd enjoy each other's company if you actually attempted conversation beyond. Please pass the spectroscope. Ethan risked another glance at Lyra. She was finishing her meal, her attention on a data tablet, her entire posture suggesting someone deliberately occupying their mind to avoid acknowledging the social activity around them. He understood that impulse intimately. What would I even talk about? He asked Sarah. I don't know plants. You're both scientists. Start with work and see what happens. Sarah stood, collecting her dishes. But do it soon, because I'm placing bets with Marcus about whether you'll work up the nerve before your contract ends in 6 months, and I'd like to win. She left before Ethan could protest that betting on his social life was both inappropriate and depressing, though he couldn't really argue with either point. The rest of the day passed in comfortable routine, data analysis, sample preparation, adjusting growth conditions in the environmental chambers where his experimental crops struggled to survive. The work was meditative, requiring focus that left no room for social anxiety or thoughts about silver-skinned researchers with expressive ears. Except he kept thinking about her anyway. Around 2100 local time, when most of the outpost had retired to quarters or relocated to the recreation area for whatever passed as downtime among scientists too obsessed with their work to have hobbies, Ethan returned to the lab to check on a timed observation. He found Lyra there, bent over a microscope in the protein synthesis station, her usual immaculate appearance slightly disheveled in ways that suggested she'd been working for hours without break. Ethan hesitated in the doorway. He could retreat, come back later, avoid the potential awkwardness of interrupting her work. But something about her posture, the exhaustion evident in the droop of her ears, the way she rubbed her eyes in a gesture that seemed almost human, made him pause. Sarah's words echoed, maybe you'd enjoy each other's company. Before he could talk himself out of it, Ethan moved to the small kitchenette area and prepared 2 cups of tea. The outpost stocked varieties compatible with multiple species biochemistries, a necessity when your research team couldn't share basic metabolic processes. He'd learned that Velkari could process most human beverages, and he'd seen Lyra accept tea during formal team meetings. He approached her station carefully, not wanting to startle her. Dr. Lyra. She looked up sharply, her ears snapping to attention. For a moment he saw genuine surprise in her expression, quickly schooled back to neutral politeness. Dr. Cole, I did not realize anyone else was still working. Late observation schedule, Ethan explained, offering one of the tea cups. I made extra if you'd like some. Lyra stared at the offered cup for a long moment, and Ethan became acutely aware he might have just committed some cultural faux pas he didn't understand. But then her hand reached out, careful, deliberate, and accepted the cup with both hands in a gesture that felt formal. Thank you, she said quietly. That is thoughtful. Ethan settled at his own workstation, close enough for comfortable conversation, but far enough to respect her personal space. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of equipment and occasional scratch of stylus on data tablet. It was, Ethan thought, possibly the most comfortable he'd felt around another person in months. Eventually, Lyra spoke without looking up from her microscope. The protein synthesis is not proceeding as predicted. I have adjusted variables multiple times, but the yield remains inconsistent. Have you tried reducing the temperature by 2 degrees? Ethan suggested. Some of the Kepler 7b specimens I'm working with are temperature sensitive in unexpected ways. Small adjustments make significant difference. I had not considered that. She made a note. I will test tomorrow, thank you. More silence, but it felt less heavy now. Ethan finished his observation data, closed his workstation, and stood to leave. Dr. Cole. Lyra's voice stopped him. Yes. She was looking at him now, her gold eyes direct in a way that made his breath catch. Thank you for the tea, and for the company. It was pleasant. The words were formal, carefully chosen, but something in her expression suggested they cost effort to say. Any time, Ethan managed. I'm usually here late if you ever want someone to work near. He left before he could see her reaction, heart beating faster than the simple interaction warranted, and told himself he was being ridiculous. But when he lay in his quarters later, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, his mind kept returning to the way she'd said pleasant, as if the word itself was a revelation. Ethan spent the next several days doing something he usually avoided: research into alien cultural practices. The Outpost's database held extensive information on the species represented in their facility, including detailed files on Velkari social structures that made his head hurt trying to understand. The Velkari, he learned, had evolved in underground clan networks where space was limited and conflict potentially fatal. Their entire society developed around collective harmony, elaborate protocols for every interaction, ritualized language that avoided individual emotion or opinion, social structures where the clan's needs superseded any individual's desires. Personal praise was effectively taboo. Achievements were celebrated collectively, as clan accomplishments rather than individual success. Commenting on someone's appearance was so rare it carried significant weight, acknowledging individual variance from group norms, drawing attention to personal qualities rather than collective identity. Ethan processed this information with growing understanding of why Lyra kept herself so separate from the Outpost's casual social dynamics. Every informal conversation, every spontaneous joke, every personal compliment that the other species traded freely, all of it probably felt like noise she didn't have cultural framework to navigate. No wonder she looked isolated. She was, by the standards of her own culture, in the social equivalent of sensory overload constantly. "Learn anything interesting?" Sarah asked, appearing at his shoulder while he read through particularly dense cultural documentation. "That I've been unconsciously correct in giving her space," Ethan said. "The Velkari don't do casual social contact. It's all formalized or it's nothing. Which makes her posting here either incredibly brave or incredibly lonely." Sarah read over his shoulder. "Though notice the section about bonding language. When they do form close personal relationships, there are specific formal phrases they use. It's rare, but it happens." Ethan scanned the highlighted section. The formal terms were complex, wrapped in cultural context he barely grasped, but the core concept was clear. Velkari could form individual connections outside clan structures, but doing so required deliberate choice and formal acknowledgement. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you like her, and you should know what you're getting into if you actually manage to develop a friendship." Sarah's tone was uncharacteristically serious. "The Velkari don't do casual, Ethan. If she lets you in at all, it'll be significant. So make sure you're ready for that before you push." "I'm not pushing anything. We shared a lab space once and had polite conversation." "You made her tea and offered comfortable silence, which is apparently your version of flirting. Just be careful, both of you." Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself intersecting with Lyra's routine more often. Not deliberately, or at least, not entirely deliberately, but their research schedules naturally overlapped, and the lab was a shared space where they both worked better than in their individual quarters. They developed an unspoken system. Ethan would arrive first and prepare tea. Lyra would arrive shortly after and accept it with that same careful formality. They'd work in comfortable silence, occasionally discussing research problems or sharing observations, conversations that stayed professional but felt less stiff as days passed. He learned small things about her through observation. She hummed softly while examining particularly interesting data. Her ears did a slight twist when she was concentrating hard. She had a preference for the workstation near the window where she could see the purple grasslands beyond. And sometimes, when the communal dining area was particularly loud and chaotic, she'd catch his eye across the room with an expression that suggested she found it as overwhelming as he did. "You're getting better at this," Sarah observed one afternoon, watching Ethan and Lyra work at adjacent stations. "At what?" "Not being completely terrified of human interaction. Or in this case, Velkari interaction." "We're just working, it's not." "It's definitely something," Sarah interrupted. "She smiles at you, Actual smiles, not just polite facial positioning. Do you know how rare that is? Ethan looked at where Lyra sat, focused on her microscope, her usual neutral expression giving nothing away. She's probably just comfortable with the routine. Keep telling yourself that. The moment came on an otherwise unremarkable morning. Ethan arrived at the lab to find Lyra already there. Unusual, since he typically arrived first, examining one of his flowering specimens with visible fascination. "Good morning," he said, moving to prepare their tea. "Good morning, Dr. Cole." She didn't look up from the plant. "This specimen is remarkable. The bioluminescence in the petals, it is similar to forests on my homeworld." "It's from Kepler 6c, actually. The pollination mechanism involves." Ethan stopped as he turned with the tea and actually looked at her. She was wearing different robes than usual. Still the practical research attire, but instead of her usual neutral grays, these were deep blue that made her silver skin seem to glow. It was such a small change, barely noticeable except he'd spent months observing her daily appearance, and this was the first variation he'd ever seen. It struck him as significant, a tiny act of individual expression from someone whose culture discouraged exactly that. "You look very pretty today," he said, the words emerging before his social anxiety could stop them. Lyra went absolutely still. Then her ears snapped to complete attention, her eyes widened. Her skin's luminescence flared so bright it was like someone had turned up her internal lighting. Color flooded her face, a deep blue-purple blush that spread from her cheeks down her neck, visible even against her silver complexion. She made a sound, not quite a gasp, more like someone who'd just been struck by something unexpected and overwhelming. Her hands flew up, covering her face in a gesture Ethan had never seen from any Velkari, and she stumbled backward until she hit the lab bench. She started, her voice tight and strange. I need to." Ethan realized with horror that other researchers had turned to look, drawn by Lyra's unprecedented reaction. The attention only seemed to make it worse. Her luminescence was flickering now, her ears flattening against her head in what he'd learned was a Velkari distress signal. "Excuse me," she managed, and fled the lab with none of her usual grace, her hands still covering her face. The lab fell into shocked silence. "Oh shit," someone said. "What just happened?" Marcus asked, staring at the door Lyra had disappeared through. Ethan stood frozen, holding 2 cups of tea, his brain trying to process what had just occurred. He'd said something terrible, something wrong. He'd hurt her somehow, and he had no idea what or how or. Sarah appeared at his elbow, her expression cycling between concern and something that might have been fascination. "Ethan," she said carefully, "what exactly did you say to her?" I told her she looked pretty. Her robes are different today, blue instead of gray, and I thought," his voice cracked, "I don't know what I did wrong." Sarah pulled up her data tablet with urgent speed, fingers flying across the interface. "Oh my God, Ethan, do you have any idea what you just did?" "Apparently something terrible," Ethan said, setting down the tea with shaking hands. "I need to apologize. I need to. You need to calm down and listen to me for 1 second." Sarah grabbed his arm. "That wasn't anger. I don't even know what that was, but it definitely wasn't rejection." She ran away. She was clearly distressed. She was overwhelmed. There's a difference. Sarah was pulling up cultural files now, her expression growing more amazed by the second. "Ethan, in Velkari culture, personal compliments, especially about appearance, are considered incredibly intimate. Like reserved for family or bonded partners intimate. You basically just made what their culture would interpret as a significant romantic declaration." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What?" "Look." Sarah showed him the documentation, highlighting passages about Velkari bonding language and cultural protocols around individual acknowledgement. Direct personal praise is rare. Commenting on someone's appearance is even rarer because it draws attention to individual variance from collective norms. When it does happen, it's either within close family clan or between bonded pairs. It's not casual. It's never casual. But I didn't know that. She looked nice and I said so. I know, and she knows you couldn't have understood the cultural weight, but that doesn't change what your words meant in her context. Sarah's expression was sympathetic now. You told her, in front of witnesses, that you see her as an individual worthy of personal attention and praise, that you notice her specific qualities and find them attractive. In her culture, that's not just flirting, that's making your intentions clear. Ethan sat down heavily, his head spinning. I created an international incident by being nice. You created an emotional crisis by accidentally hitting every button in her cultural programming about individual acknowledgement and personal bonds. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. But Ethan, her reaction wasn't anger. It was feeling too much, too fast, too publicly. She didn't know how to process it, so she fled. That's not the same as being offended. How do you know? Because I've spent 3 years studying cross-species emotional responses, and that was joy, surprise, and overwhelming emotion. If she were offended or insulted, her response would have been cold withdrawal, not. Sarah gestured vaguely. That. What do I do? You talk to her, explain what you meant. But also, and this is important, be honest about whether you actually meant it as more than casual compliment. Because if you did, you just accidentally initiated a courtship protocol that her species takes very seriously. And if you didn't, you need to clarify that before she interprets your words as deliberate declaration. Ethan thought about the past weeks. The comfortable silences, the tea ritual, the way he'd found himself organizing his schedule around her presence. The realization that he looked for her first when entering any shared space, that her rare smiles felt like victories, that the idea of his contract ending and leaving the outpost was painful primarily because it meant leaving her. I think I might have meant it, he said quietly. Sarah grinned. Then you definitely need to talk to her, because she just experienced the most significant personal acknowledgement probably of her entire life, and she has no idea if it was accident or intention. Don't leave her hanging. Finding Lyra was easier said than done. She didn't respond to messages, and her quarters were locked with privacy settings engaged. Ethan spent the rest of the day in anxious uncertainty, unable to focus on work, replaying the moment over and over. Had she looked happy before the distress set in? Had that initial reaction been positive, or had he completely misread everything and created a disaster? By evening, he couldn't stand it anymore. He went to her quarters and requested entry, half expecting to be ignored. Instead, after a long pause, the door opened. Lyra stood in the doorway, looking exhausted and vibrating with suppressed emotion. Her ears were flat against her head, but her eyes fixed on him with desperate intensity. "Why did you say those words to me?" she asked without preamble, her voice tight with control. "What did you mean by them?" And Ethan, looking at her distress and realizing this mattered far more than his usual social anxiety, made a choice. He'd be completely honest, consequences be damned. Ethan had prepared an apology. A careful, diplomatic explanation about cultural misunderstanding and innocent intentions. All the words that would smooth this over and restore professional distance. Every single one of them evaporated when he saw Lyra's face. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. "This conversation feels too important for a doorway." Lyra hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him entry to quarters he'd never seen before. They were Spartan. Velkari apparently didn't believe in personal decoration, but there were small touches. A data tablet displaying what looked like images of bioluminescent forests, a small plant on the windowsill that was definitely from his experimental samples, research notes scattered across a desk in patterns that suggested she'd been trying to work and failing. She stood in the center of the room, her posture rigid, waiting. "I didn't understand the cultural significance," Ethan started. "Sarah explained after you left, about how personal compliments work in Velkari society, about bonding language and collective identity versus individual acknowledgement. I didn't know I was saying something so." He searched for the word significant. "But you said it anyway," Lyra said, her voice strange. "You looked at me and spoke those words." "Because I thought you looked beautiful," Ethan said honestly. "The blue robes suit you." They make your skin's luminescence more visible, and I've noticed you wear neutral colors exclusively, so this seemed like a change, like you were expressing something, and I wanted you to know I noticed and appreciated it. Lyra's hands clenched at her sides. You noticed my appearance. You found it worthy of comment. You expressed this appreciation publicly. Yes, Ethan said, then forced himself to continue. And I'm realizing now that I've been noticing you for months. How you move, how your ears express emotions your face doesn't show, how you hum when you're examining data. I've been organizing my schedule, romantic interest, but if I'm being completely honest, which seems important right now, I think I've been falling for you without fully admitting it to myself. Silence. Lyra stared at him, her luminescence flickering in patterns he couldn't interpret, her ears doing complex adjustments that might mean anything. You have romantic interest, she said finally. In me, specifically. Yes. I know it's probably inappropriate, given we're colleagues in different species, and I clearly don't understand your culture well enough to navigate this properly, but yes. That's why I said you looked pretty. Not because I was being casually nice, but because I think you're remarkable, and I apparently can't stop myself from saying so even when it creates massive cultural misunderstandings. More silence, then. In my entire life, no one outside my birth clan has acknowledged me as individual worthy of personal attention. The Velkari collective model means we exist as parts of larger whole. Our achievements are celebrated as clan success. Our appearances are deliberately uniform to avoid drawing individual attention. Our emotions are private matters to be processed internally rather than expressed externally. She moved to the window, her back to him. I came to this outpost partially to escape that, to exist in a place where individual contributions mattered, where being Lyra rather than just Velkari researcher might be possible. But I brought all my conditioning with me, all the rules about not drawing attention, not expressing individual emotion, not expecting personal recognition. And then I dumped personal recognition on you in the middle of the lab with witnesses, Ethan said quietly. Yes. Lyra turned back to face him, and he saw her eyes were brighter than usual, luminescence suggesting intensity of emotion. You saw me, as myself, as an individual with specific qualities worth commenting on. You looked at me and found me, her voice caught, pretty, beautiful, worthy of that kind of attention. Because you are, Ethan said, all of those things. I did not know how to process that, Lyra continued. The emotions your words created, they were overwhelming. Joy, fear, confusion, a feeling I have no name for because my culture has no language for being individually valued. I felt too much, too quickly, too publicly. So I fled because I did not know what else to do. She took a step closer. But I was not offended. I was not insulted. I was affected in ways I have never experienced, and I did not understand what it meant. And now, Ethan asked, after you've had time to process. Lyra's ears tilted forward. He'd learned this was her version of a smile, the physical tell that betrayed positive emotion. Now I think you should know that I have been noticing you as well. Your patience with your plants, your kindness to all species regardless of their social skills, the way you make space for silence rather than filling it with empty words. I have been arriving at the lab at times I knew you would be there. Accepting tea because it gave me excuse to stay in your presence. Choosing workstations near yours even when other spaces were available. Ethan felt something in his chest expand, warm and bright. You've been falling for me too. I did not have language for it, Lyra said. My culture does not prepare us for individual romantic attachment. But yes, I believe that is accurate description. And when you spoke those words this morning, when you looked at me and said I was pretty, I realized you saw me the way I have been secretly hoping someone might. As Lyra, as myself. Not as representative of my species or role in collective structure, but as individual being you find worthy of attention. I do, Ethan said, find you worthy of attention, of compliments, of anything you want, honestly, because I'm pretty far gone at this point. Lyra made a sound that might have been a laugh, soft, uncertain, like someone testing unfamiliar expression. I do not know how to do this. How to have individual romantic relationship when my entire culture is built around collective bonds. How to express emotions I was taught to suppress. How to be person rather than just role. I don't know how to do it either, Ethan admitted. I'm socially anxious, terrible at reading emotional cues, constantly worried I'm saying the wrong thing. We're both working without proper instructions here. Perhaps that is acceptable, Lyra said quietly. Perhaps we figure it out together. I'd like that. Ethan took a careful step closer, closing some of the distance between them but still respecting her space. Though I should probably learn proper Velkari cultural protocols, so I don't accidentally declare marriage intentions or something equally binding. That earned a genuine laugh, musical, surprised, immediately cut off as Lyra covered her mouth with her hand. But her eyes were bright with amusement and Ethan grinned. I like that sound. I'd like to hear it more if you're comfortable with that. I am not accustomed to being comfortable with expression of joy, Lyra said, lowering her hand slowly. But perhaps I could become accustomed, with practice. We could practice together. Comfortable silence, genuine compliments, occasional laughter. Build something neither of our cultures has clear protocols for. Lyra's ears did that forward tilt again. That sounds pleasant, though I should warn you, the Velkari concept of romantic partnership when it occurs outside clan bonds is called chosen companion. It is rare, formally acknowledged, and considered binding commitment. I do not know if humans have similar concept. We have several, Ethan said. Dating, relationship, partnership, marriage, different levels of commitment, all basically meaning person I choose to be with. So yes, similar concept, just with more flexibility about formality. I would like to explore that, Lyra said carefully. This chosen companionship, with you. If you are willing to accept that I will be learning as we proceed, that I will sometimes retreat into cultural conditioning, that I may not always express emotions in ways you recognize. I'm willing to accept all of that if you're willing to accept that I'm socially anxious, emotionally inarticulate, and will probably say awkward things at inopportune moments. Your awkwardness is part of what I value, Lyra said, and the earnestness in her voice made Ethan's heart do complicated things. You do not demand social performance. You allow people to exist as they are. This is gift, not flaw. They stood in silence for a moment, processing what they'd just agreed to. Then Lyra extended her hand, palm up, fingers slightly curved, a gesture Ethan didn't recognize but understood instinctively as invitation. He placed his hand in hers, their fingers intertwining, and watched her luminescence flare brighter at the contact. Is this okay? He asked. I don't want to push. This is better than okay, Lyra interrupted. This is first time I have initiated physical contact with someone outside my clan and felt only positive emotion. No anxiety about protocol breach, no fear of collective judgment, just. She paused, searching for words. Happiness. Simple, individual happiness at touching someone I choose. That's a good start, Ethan said, squeezing her hand gently. Yes, Lyra agreed, her ears tilting forward in that expression he was learning to treasure. It is very good start. They stood in her quarters, holding hands and figuring out how to build something unprecedented, and Ethan thought about the simple compliment that had started this. Words he almost didn't say, creating cascade of emotion neither of them expected. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm glad I told you that you looked pretty, even though I didn't understand the implications. I am glad as well, Lyra said. Your words overwhelmed me, but they also freed me. Gave me permission to feel things I had been suppressing, to want things I thought impossible. She looked at him directly. You saw me as individual worthy of compliment. That is the most significant thing anyone has ever done for me. And Ethan, holding the hand of an alien woman whose culture had no template for individual romantic love, but who was choosing to try anyway, thought that maybe social awkwardness wasn't always a liability. Sometimes it meant you said the honest thing instead of the appropriate thing, and sometimes that made all the difference. The outpost adapted to their relationship with varying degrees of grace. Sarah took full credit for encouraging Ethan to actually communicate. Marcus made awkward attempts at congratulating them while clearly having no idea if that was culturally appropriate. And Kresh expressed the Thenari equivalent of finally. The tension was becoming noticeable. The other Velkari researchers in nearby facilities apparently had opinions, transmitted through formal channels that Lyra received and largely ignored. The consensus seemed to be shocked that she'd formed individual bond outside clan structure, concern about cultural precedent, and grudging acknowledgement that technically she wasn't violating any specific protocols since she was on foreign posting and ancient provisions existed for choosing companions in isolated circumstances. They are upset that I am happy, Lyra summarized after reading a particularly long message. They do not say this directly, but it is clear from subtext. My choice to prioritize individual fulfillment over collective expectation makes them uncomfortable. Do you care? Ethan asked. They were in the lab together, their usual position now, working side by side with comfortable ease. I care that they are distressed, but not enough to change my behavior. She looked at him, her ears tilting forward. I have spent 34 years prioritizing collective over individual. I am choosing differently now. They built their relationship in small increments, both hyper-aware of cultural differences and committed to navigating them carefully. Ethan learned that Velkari didn't kiss. The gesture had no cultural equivalent, but that pressing foreheads together while maintaining eye contact was their version of intimate connection. That Lyra's luminescence responded to emotional state in ways she couldn't entirely control, creating a physical tell for feelings she'd been trained to hide. That she needed alone time to process social interactions, retreating to her quarters not because she was upset, but because her conditioning required mental space to integrate experiences. Lyra learned that humans needed more verbal affirmation than her species, that Ethan's social anxiety meant he sometimes needed reassurance that he hadn't overstepped, that physical touch was important to him in ways that didn't translate to Velkari norms, that she could ask for space without him interpreting it as rejection, could express needs without fear of collective judgment, could actually say, I need time alone, without having to justify why. They had their moments of miscommunication, times when Ethan interpreted Lyra's need for space as emotional withdrawal, times when Lyra didn't realize Ethan needed verbal acknowledgement of their bond. But they worked through it, learning each other's languages, both literal and emotional. About 6 weeks into their official relationship, they were in the observation lounge late at night. Lyra curled against Ethan's side in a position that had taken her days to feel comfortable attempting. The physical intimacy was still new, still overwhelming for someone whose culture discouraged casual touch. But she discovered she craved it when the source was someone she'd chosen. Tell me about your family, Ethan said quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm that made her luminescence flicker pleasantly. Lyra was silent for a moment, processing. My birth clan is large, 47 members across 4 generations, all living in connected underground habitat on Velkar Prime. I have 3 sibling equivalents, though we do not think of ourselves as individuals in the way humans do, more like parts of larger family unit. Do you miss them? Sometimes, but mostly I feel relief at the distance. She paused, testing how to articulate something she'd never said aloud. I was not good Velkari. I felt too much, wanted too much individual recognition, struggled to suppress emotions the way our culture requires. My clan loved me, but they also did not understand me. I think they are relieved I am here, where my difficulty with collective harmony cannot disrupt their structure. Their loss, Ethan said, you're extraordinary. Lyra's luminescence flared bright enough to light the room, and she pressed her forehead against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the compliment in the best way. You say such things easily. Because they're true, but they overwhelm me every time. She lifted her head to look at him. I do not think I will ever become accustomed to being individually praised. It affects me too deeply. Is that bad? No, she made the decision consciously, allowed herself to smile, full, genuine expression that she'd been trained to suppress. It is wonderful, overwhelming and wonderful. They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars through the observation window, and Lyra thought about the journey from lonely researcher to chosen companion, from suppressed individual to person allowed to feel. I need to tell you something, she said eventually. In my culture, there is term for what we have developed. It does not translate perfectly, but closest human equivalent would be chosen companion or perhaps bonded individual. It means person selected from outside clan structure to walk beside you through life. Ethan's hand stilled on her arm. That sounds serious. It is, very serious. When Velkari form such bonds, it is considered permanent commitment, formally acknowledged by both parties and their respective clans. It is not casual experiment. She lifted her head to meet his eyes. I do not know if humans have similar concept or if I am moving too quickly by human standards, but I believe you have become this for me. And I wanted you to know. Ethan was quiet for a long moment and Lyra felt fear spike through her. Had she misread? Was he not ready? Was this too much? Then he smiled, the gentle expression that had first made her feel safe around him. We call it falling in love, or being in love, or sometimes just love, depending on context. It's the recognition that another person has become essential to your happiness, that you want to share your life with them. He reached up to cup her face gently. And yes, I feel it too. Have probably felt it since the moment you blushed at my compliment, and I realized you were capable of being overwhelmed by happiness. Lyra's luminescence brightened until she was practically glowing. You love me. Yes, Ethan said simply. I love you. I love your brilliant mind, your quiet strength, the way you're learning to let yourself feel emotions your culture trained you to hide. I love that you chose me specifically out of all possible companions. And I'm in this for as long as you want me. Forever is acceptable timeline, Lyra said, her voice shaking. If that is agreeable to you, forever works for me. She kissed him then. Not a Velkari gesture, but a human one she'd been curious about, and found she liked it, the physical expression of emotion that her species had no equivalent for. When they broke apart, she was definitely crying, bioluminescent tears tracking down her face, and she found she didn't care who saw or what it meant by Velkari standards. She was happy. Individually, personally, overwhelmingly happy, and that mattered more than any collective protocol. The next morning, they returned to the lab together, no longer hiding their connection but not announcing it either. They worked side by side, occasionally bumping shoulders or exchanging small smiles, building something unprecedented one gentle moment at a time. Sarah appeared mid-morning with a data tablet and a grin. I'm updating the facility reports on successful human-alien collaboration. Need to note that Dr. Cole's research productivity increased 40% since forming working partnership with Dr. Lyra, and that her protein synthesis breakthrough last week came after consultation with him. Also documenting that cross-species emotional bonds facilitate research cooperation. You're putting our relationship in official reports, Ethan asked, amused. I'm documenting that emotional connection creates better science, which happens to be true. Sarah's grin widened. Also, you're both adorable, and I'm taking full credit for encouraging you to actually talk to her, instead of just making tea and hoping she'd read your mind. Your contribution is noted, Lyra said with that small smile that lit up her whole face. Thank you, I accept my award for best wingman in the research community. Sarah looked at them both, her expression softening. Seriously though, I'm happy for you, both of you. You're building something really special here. After she left, Ethan and Lyra returned to their work. But when another researcher, Dr. Park, made a casual comment about Lyra looking particularly radiant today, Ethan responded clearly. She does, doesn't she? And Lyra blushed, that overwhelming, full-body reaction that turned her luminescence brilliant and colored her face deep purple blue. But this time she didn't flee. She squeezed Ethan's hand under the lab bench and smiled, choosing to let her joy show, choosing to be seen as individual worthy of compliment and love. Yes, she said softly, her voice carrying confidence she'd never felt before. I am having very good day. Sarah, observing from her own workstation, made a note in her personal log. Successful integration of Valkyrie researcher into mixed species social environment achieved through patient companionship and genuine emotional connection. Dr. Cole's approach, treating her as individual rather than cultural representative, providing safe space for emotional expression, offering compliments without expectation, created breakthrough in cross-species relationship dynamics. Also, they're incredibly cute together, and I was absolutely right about encouraging this. Recommend further study of human Valkyrie